I make reference to my entry in the Register of Interests, where I'm listed as a member of the advisory group of the not-for-profit organisation Sex Matters, and I'm also a supporter of the Lesbian, Gay and Bisexual Alliance, and proud to be so. The honourable member for Plymouth, Sutton and Devonport says that he's a massive gay. Well, I'm a massive lesbian, rather more massive than I was in my younger years. But anyway, I want to challenge everyone who said in this debate this afternoon that they want a respectful debate on reform of the GRA. And I want to challenge them to live up to their words and listen to the concerns that are held by many women and same-sex attracted people about the dangers of conflating sex with gender. Like them, I share the view that the introduction of self-identification of sex would negatively impact on existing provisions under the Equalities Act, and that this view is valid and well-founded, has been supported by the recent intervention of the Equality and Human Rights Commission. Their concerns centre on the potential consequences for individuals and society of extending the ability to change legal sex from a small defined group who've demonstrated their commitment and ability to live in their acquired gender to a much wider group who identify as the opposite gender at a given point. So it is not a modest reform. It's a reform with potential consequences, including those relating to the collection and use of data, the participation and drug testing in competitive sport, measures to address discrimination barriers facing women, and practices within the criminal justice system. Now, reform of the Gender Recognition Act is proposed in Scotland and supported by my party. And last year, our manifesto for the Scottish election said that we would work with trans people, women, equality groups, legal and human rights experts to identify the best and most effective way to improve and simplify the process by which a trans person can obtain legal recognition so that the trauma with that process is reduced. And our manifesto also said that we will ensure that these changes do not affect the rights or protections that women currently have under the Equality Act. And I was content to support that policy, which did not commit the SNP to a policy of self-ID. And what I have to say today is in line with my party's promise to work with women, equality groups, legal and human rights experts, and to ensure that reforms to the GRA don't affect the rights or protections that women currently have under the Equality Act. Now, under the Equality Act, there are a number of protected characteristics, and they include sex, sexual orientation, belief, which we now know, thanks to the Employment Appeal Tribunal, includes gender-critical beliefs, such as I hold. And the Equality Act also protects people who are at any stage of a personal journey of transition, or indeed de-transition. And so widely accepted are those protected characteristics that when my party were trying to win the independence referendum in Scotland in 2014, our current First Minister and then Deputy First Minister produced a draft constitution for an independent Scotland which would have enshrined those personal characteristics in the fundamental law of an independent Scotland alongside the human rights protected by the ECHR. Now, I just want to correct something that the Honourable Member for Brighton Kemp Town said. There are laws about who can use which toilet. Under the and women shouldn't be expected to share their intimate spaces with men. Under the Equality Act, security staff and school supervisors, etc., are allowed to set and enforce single-sex rules. The Equality Act exceptions allow that. It's not a matter of criminal law, it's a matter of the civil law. So it's important to be clear about these things. Because if we lose clarity over what the words male and female mean, it will make it more difficult to set and enforce clear and simple rules for female-only services and women's sports. Now, some people have been very critical of the Equalities and Human Rights Commission for seeming to have modified their position on self-identification for trans people and reform of the Gender Recognition Act. But Baroness Falkner has been very clear that they have done so because new evidence about the tension between trans and women's rights has emerged. And I would remind those who've sought to impugn the Equality and Human Rights Commission and Baroness Falkner that her appointment was unanimously approved by the Women and Equalities Committee and the Joint Committee of Human Rights after an evidential hearing in this Parliament. So there is ample evidence that the concerns of the Equality and Human Rights Commission are well-founded. And in fact, only last week in Scotland, we had two major legal decisions seemingly in conflict about the meaning of sex in law. Fortunately, because of the appellate system, we know that the appellate court's decision will take precedence. And the appellate court in Scotland was very clear that as our current law stands under the Equality Act, sex is not interchangeable with gender. There's a protected characteristic of sex, but there's not one of gender. There is a protected characteristic of gender reassignment. But the appeal court in Scotland was very clear that sex means male or female in law based on biological sex. That's the highest interpretation we have of the Equality Act in our law at present. So the word women in the Equality Act doesn't include males who self-identify as women. Now, to find out what the general populace think about self-ID, we can look at some recent polling. And we've had 2 big opinion polls in Scotland in the last month and also a BBC survey, which have shown that while the majority of Scots support equal rights for trans people, as for the avoidance of doubt, do I, they are unhappy about the implications of a system of self-ID of sex without a gatekeeper. Not because it will discriminate against trans people, but because it opens up self-identification of sex to anyone, to a much wider group than trans people. Now, many of the groups, like LGB Alliance, who've tried to promote a respectful dialogue in relation to these matters, have not had the sort of reception that the Honourable Member for Carshalton and Wallington has suggested they should, and they've been vilified, sometimes by members of this House, and that's not right.
Hear, hear.
We need to have a respectful debate. By all means, let's reform the 2004 Act, but let's do it in a way that respects the protected characteristics that are enshrined in our Equality Act and takes into account the legitimate concerns of many women and same-sex attracted people. Thank you.
Hanvey.
Thank you, Mr Chairman. It's a pleasure to serve under your chairmanship. I want to begin by paying tribute to the Honourable Member for Carshalton and Wallington for his excellent opening remarks and his tightrope walk through what is an incredibly difficult issue. I think he did an absolutely outstanding job. It was a wet and windy winter evening. Around about 2013, I made my way across to Edinburgh for a consultation that was being run by the Equalities Network in Scotland, and it was on the choice of campaign activity following the successful equal marriage campaign. I was the only politician that turned up. It was myself and a room full of trans men and women, and we had a really fantastic discussion and debate about how important it was to improve visibility and acceptance and inclusion, and I gave that process my full support on that evening. Indeed, I've been campaigning for LGBT rights all my adult life. I have lived my life professionally, but in the open. I was out at work before it was trendy, and I have faced down prejudice in the workplace with the usual tropes of, I remember one particularly challenging story where somebody referred to a paedophile who was being sentenced on the television as, well, it's just the same as you. So that involved quite a lengthy conversation, but it was basically about consent's kind of an important difference, distinct about many other issues. So I've dealt with all of these tropes. I've faced up to them. I've marched against Section 28. I've marched and even performed one year at Pride. However, since 2019, I mistakenly thought that my experience of safeguarding in the NHS, my years of activism in response to the HIV and AIDS crisis, and my recent role as the chair of Fife Pride would help me bridge the gap between trans rights activists and women's groups. But in my bringing to the fore questions that hitherto would have been routine to any policy development, I was targeted and quite wrongly labelled, amongst many other things, a transphobe. And the reason is because I would not submit unquestioningly to gender ideology. And what I've witnessed has been horrific. People who call themselves straight allies or queer-identifying straight people have quite literally pushed gay men and lesbians out of our own movement. I can think of no clearer an example than Alexander Brahman, a gay man who was bullied out of Manchester Pride by a straight woman. In all the years I have been out, the worst homophobia I have experienced has been in the last 2 years, and much of it has happened in this place. And despite formally raising those concerns, it has not been taken seriously and was simply not addressed. Homophobia is back, and after all the years we spent battling down those barriers, it's back at the behest of Stonewall, and it's draped in a pride flag. Because if you remove sex, there can be no homosexual. Sex matters. It is a defining characteristic of who I am. Just saying that has seen me branded a hate figure, targeted for harassment, referred to by an honourable member in this place as a homophobic blank. You can fill it in yourself. One of the most contentious issues centres on how the word woman is defined in law. Does it mean human adult female, or should it be broader than that and include NATO males who decide to live as women and transition? Clarity on this carries significance for how we understand other protected characteristics within the Equalities Act, including same-sex attracted people, and whether a trans woman who is attracted to a natal female is indeed a lesbian. The ruling from the Inner House of the Court of Session last week was unequivocal. For the purposes of the protected characteristics of sex in the 2010 Equalities Act, a woman is a natal female of any age, a man is a natal male of any age, and the rights and protections of the trans community are rightly provided under the discrete protected characteristic for gender reassignment. But how this decision interacts with GRA reform in Scotland remains to be seen. But as sex and gender are now considered very separate terms, this may require further legal attention. These issues matter, and this legal clarity is of enormous significance. And I want to pay tribute to Marion, Trina, Susan and everyone at For Women Scotland for their courage, determination and success. I have demonstrated my resilience against outrageous behaviour over these past 2 years, and I want to pay tribute to the Honourable Member for Brigg and Gould, Chair of the Anti-Semitism APPG, and Danny Stone, Chief Executive of the Anti-Semitism Policy Trust, for their confidence, support and guidance. These impacts ripple well beyond me. Women are being targeted on social media and in the workplace for holding a view which is now an established point of law. They have been told that this view was invalid by the First Minister of Scotland. I hold a deep sadness that people I have worked closely with have used their influence as LGBT campaigners and politicians to bully, harass and silence women. What is now clear is that this is a breach of equalities legislation, and it must cease. For all the years I marched, cared for sick friends and dying friends, raised awareness in the workplace and schools and in my community, my greatest allies have always been women. My mum, my friend Lynn, my friend Fee, my friends Anne and Susan and many, many others. They stood by me through thick and thin, and I will not abandon them now. Now that we have legal clarity over the meaning of sex, we must find a way to tackle this matter and improve the lives of trans people and reform GRA. But as both Baroness Faulkner, the current chair, and Trevor Phillips, the founding chair of the HRC, have made clear in recent days, equalities is a matter of mutual respect, balance and compromise, and not something that can be dictated by loud, uncompromising voices. The era of no debate is firmly over. It's time to heal deep, deep wounds and focus on a policy that delivers meaningful improvements to the lives and safety of the trans population whilst respecting the rights of others. Thank you.